Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. Today, we've got a very special guest and subject. We have on Manoj Jasra. Now, Manoj, you are a three-time B2B CMO. You specialize in PE-backed startups and companies. You've actually worked in a lot of different industry sectors, B2C and B2B. So you've got a very broad perspective that you're bringing to the podcast today. Before we get into our subject matter, which is how do you take these CMO and PE-backed perspectives that you have, and how do we create value quickly? Because one of the things that we all know is we don't last long as CMOs. B2B CMOs have the shortest tenure in the C-suite. So one of the things that we can do right away, and I know you're starting a new role right now, is how do we create value quickly? Not only internally within the organization, but recognized, right, all the way up through the board. So that's not always an easy thing to do. But before we get into that and how you do it, what your brand of that is, maybe you could give us just a little bit more on your background before we get started.
Yep. Thank you for having me, Steve. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. You're right. I have played in a lot of sectors. I actually started off as a software developer early 2000s, changed over to digital marketer, and then have just followed my path of trying to stay as uncomfortable as possible and being challenged as possible. And that's why you see the sector changes, because I think I pride myself on really learning a lot of different areas and applying those interesting things to new ways of doing things and new businesses. And for the most part of my career, like I would say the first 12 to 15 years were B2C, but the last 4 or 5 have definitely been focused on B2B growth, demand generation, and working with scale ups into even inclusive of mergers and acquisitions with PE groups. So it's been really interesting.
Also, the background of the B2C and the B2B is in today's environment, B2B customer experience expectations are exactly on par with the level that we expect in the B2C world. So this Amazon effect, we can order something and sometimes it arrives that afternoon, right? The immediacy, the amount of customer experience that B2C has traditionally been known for equally translates over to the expectations that our B2B buyers have with us as B2B organizations. So there's just a lot of similarities, and I think in your background that we want to kind of dig deeper on.
You're absolutely right. I was just going to add to that, like, you're right, the immediacy, the experience, the elevation, the quality, whereas B2B used to be, okay, you know what, we can expect less quality. But I think one thing I've really understood going from B2C to B2B now is I can quickly identify a B2C marketing strategy being applied to a B2B business incorrectly. And it's interesting because both flavored, although experience-wise, the end customer wants speed, capabilities, and things like that. And in the B2B world, it is a much longer buying cycle, but you can quickly see a potential B2C marketer find a lot of like Instagram, a lot of like social media style B2C content and trying to make that work in a B2B play and not understanding the long-term nurture that's required to actually win B2B business.
It's interesting. We're kind of on an interesting topic here before the subject matter here. From Gartner to McKinsey in the B2B world, the number one competitive advantage for businesses today, B2C or B2B, isn't product. It's not price. It's not traditional things that we've held on to. It's that customer experience. And McKinsey talks about how it's the number one factor that influences long-term value for a company. So it plays a big role in our go-to-market strategies these days. But with that, I want to come back here a little bit and get right to the topic, which is how to create value quickly. I'd just love to open it up to you in any way you want to start out and how you think about that, what your point of view is coming in, especially as a new B2B CMO in this last month.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at it from a PE private equity perspective versus a traditional, say, corporation that might be publicly traded or just larger in general. I think there's a lot of interest when a CMO or even a chief growth officer joins a company to see results fairly quickly. And so building momentum is something that I pride myself on, and it's something that is, to me, is critical for a CMO. And you said the tenure of CMOs don't last that long. And to me, the key thing is you have to like do things in parallel and maybe even 3 or 4 things in parallel at the same time. When you're launching into a new organization, especially when I've switched sectors, right? We went from technology services to a bunch of different sectors to healthcare. Trying to learn the business is obviously important because you want to be relevant in the space. When you're marketing, you want to be able to contextually talk about your services, obviously your value propositions, things like that. but you don't have the realm of trying to wait 90 days before your first campaign goes into market or having a perspective of, say, a strategy. That whole model of trying to build the plane and kind of fly it at the same time is actually really critical in this space. So you have to learn just enough, which means learning the business, creating relationships with the key product leaders, the sales leadership, the board, the executive leadership team, the CFO, and then in parallel, building a team structure and evaluating your team to say, can they actually do the job effectively and support the strategy? And then what I like to see, maybe the fourth parallel would be is how do you get something in market which shows value and shows credibility that there is pipeline growth or even interest. And what a colleague of mine calls it green shoots. And there's some green shoots that can show there's a service offering that we get to market. It's tied to obviously your customer profiles and it's showing interest already. So these are like 3 or 4 things. And it's easily said that 4 things can happen in parallel, but imagine trying to learn the business, create relationships, evaluate and structure your team, and also launch something into market. Because at the end of the day, number 4 is what you're going to be graded on. Number 3 are expectations. The first 3 are expectations.
I was thinking the exact same thing. The only thing that really matters is we're all supposed to be pipeline focused, right? CMOs have to be pipeline driven, pipeline focused. And that was the one measure of the 4 that aligned with that. I had a podcast about a year ago, and the gentleman wrote a book on this, but did a massive study and showed that it can take up to 18 months for most CMOs to do the 4 steps that you just talked about. Learn the business, get the team together, get the go-to-market strategy together, implement, get something into the market, have it be in the market long enough to demonstrate some kind of an impact where there is results that are attainable that you could then take to the board and say, look, this is what we've done. That's a much longer time than how do you show something in growth quickly, right?
Exactly right. Obviously, the gentleman has wrote probably a wonderful topic on the book and things like that. 18 months may feel right in a much more mature organization where there's time to onboard effectively and do the right things in terms of structured strategy and buy-in and let's say the budget cycles. But when you're talking about PE or scale up to startup and scale ups going to their next level, I think we're in like the 6 months or less, and then show me what you've done. I think you're in that realm. And once you've proven that, you get obviously the range to go longer, but I don't think there is an 18-month wait time in this space.
Yeah, especially when that's about 20 months is when the average CMO is let go. But I think his point was that demonstratable impact, measurable impact, either the expectation should be that it takes longer. But obviously, this is something that you're trying to do right now. So this is a very, very relevant topic as you've just taken on a new role. So what is your recommendation? I mean, we've got CMOs, we've got CROs, we've got CEOs, we've got head of sales, marketing, listening. What's your number one priority? You're coming in. The number one thing that's going to help make that difference in a short term.
A few things that I think that are relevant would be, and I'm feeling this now, and I've helped at my last firm as well, is really understanding why the company exists in the first place. Like, why do you have the ability to earn the business of most of your customers? And why do you have the right to compete? And that really underlines with what's the service offerings, what's the value proposition, and what are the differentiators in your competitive set as well. And I think once you can understand that, and like I said, you might not get the full realm of every single capability that the firm offers in the full, because in some cases, like in our world today, we probably have over 50 or 60 things we do across 6 practices and 4 verticals. That's very complex. But if you can start to shape that overall narrative and understand that, to me, it's the biggest unlock, along with alignment, that this proposition resonates with your executive team and your sales team and your product team. Because what that does, it's the foundation of everything you're going to do. It's the foundation of your strategy. So your marketing campaign roadmap, it's the strategy of the structure, the strategy of which investments you're going to make. So I believe getting to that is one of the most important pieces. And personally, I've always thought it actually helps you understand the business as well. If you can articulate and narrate very clearly what the value proposition of the business is, why it exists, what capabilities it offers, and what the differentiators are very clearly, all of a sudden you can take that to market. The rest of it, obviously, there's a lot of content that needs to be built behind it. But that, to me, is one of the biggest unlocks that I've seen.
And what I love about that is, and you clearly articulated this, is that your first audience that you have to convince of that reformation of the selling proposition for the company, how you're positioned, is internally, right? Because if you think this is the way to go, but sales isn't on board, customer success isn't on board, your CEO isn't on board, all of a sudden, that's where you're siloed. And this is a stat that I know you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I believe that. But you know what the actual average alignment between marketing and sales is of the ICP? Like the definition of the ICP, it's 16%. But I've now told that to a lot of CMOs and pros, and nobody is surprised.
I wasn't surprised to hear it, but I didn't expect to be that far off, like by 16%. So I was going to say something like 25 to 35%, somewhere in that neighborhood, but it's nuts that it's 16%.
But even at 35%, that's 2/3 of the companies don't have alignment on your
Totally.
ACP, any way you slice it. So what I loved is that your focus was, how do we align internally? How do we all have the same basic go-to-market plan is what I was taking away from what you said. Because if you don't have that, it doesn't matter any other idea, right? Any other go-to-market strategy, if you're a silo on the side that's trying to execute against that, then you're clearly not going to show short-term rewards.
It's a real quick way to make an exit if you're marketing to an ICP that the company is not aligned upon, right? It's that 18-month number again, probably becomes like 3 or 4 real quick if that's what you're up to.
If we take now into account that we have to have that internal line, talk to me a little bit about just executing on the plan, transitioning from strategy to execution, and how you think about that.
Yeah, I think this transition is important because we've assumed in the transitioning strategy that we've also got, the biggest thing that we all forget about is budget, right? So we got the strategy, but did you connect with the CFO and the executive team and the board, and did you secure budget? Let's assume that's happened. And one of the first things that I always try to do is make sure that my strategy has budget attached to it. It's very easily said, but if you don't, then you're actually setting yourself up for failure because you're not able to actually achieve the metrics and the KPIs that you're after without a sufficient budget to actually execute on it, or you're signing up for a very different strategy, which includes different levels of advertising, different levels of levers, different level of technology stacks in the middle of it without the budget. So if we assume that the budget is now approved and we got the right strategy, I think execution is also an area where kind of faltering happens. I think one of the things that I've learned is it's another very simple thing, but communication is so critical. So you communicated the strategy earlier, right? You got your board alignment and things like that, and got your executive team alignment and your sales team are aligned with your strategy. The next big communication piece is building that roadmap, which is the overall progress, the momentum, the roadblocks, the KPIs, the successes, and the CMO really owning that week to week, month to month, and sharing that information to show how we're progressing. Because that is clearly what the CFO and the CEO and the board are watching is my budget now being executed. And is it actually having traction? So I think that's a major one. And I think to me, having clear actions on who's accountable for the various parts of the roadmap, because if you can imagine a multi-stakeholder kind of situation, you have marketing in the mix, you have product, you have customer success, you have SDRs, you have the sales team, right? Each one plays a critical role. And I think ensuring that roles are well-defined, metrics are well-defined, and that there's good communication across these multi-member teams, I think those are critical for the success to happen in order for execution to exist appropriately. That's the first thing that come to mind.
One thing I wanted to ask you a little bit more about is you talked about identifying the roadblocks. Right? So not having the right budget obviously is a roadblock to an execution plan. Just in your experience, what are the top roadblocks to getting that plan executed?
We already talked about budget. Second would be I would say content is a big one, right? In order for us to execute a strategy, especially in B2B, first of all, obviously all the way from top of the funnel to bottom of the funnel, having appropriate content to support that. I think it's one of the biggest pitfalls that exists out there. Going to market without enough collateral and then expecting a single piece of collateral to be the hook to land $1 million deal. I think that's like smoke. When I talked about really understanding the priorities of the business, I always think about there's only a few kind of key things that anyone should be doing in the market at the same time. And I always say a number. Can run 3 to 5 campaigns in market at the same time that's tied to the key, say, service offerings or the key priorities of the business. And if you do not have enough content associated with all of that and tied to the right budget, you can actually have budget, advertise it, and go after ICP. You can actually just run dry, and then the nurture basically stops, and you basically stop in your tracks along the way. So that's one gap. I think we talked about ICP a few times, and I think having alignment on that, and not just that the ICP exists, further to that, who are the buying teams that exist within the ICP, right? And further to that, if you're looking at buying teams at a specific organization, what are the behaviors, the attributes, the pain points that exist per buying team member? So ICP is important, but then the final down to like detailed ICP is really critical as well. And having that now well-defined also means that when you launch into your campaigns, you might not have the right content. And if you do have the right content and you don't understand the right pain point, how are you going to mix that together at the same time? So it's actually all correlated when you think about it. And that's why I think generally why B2B marketing has to be so sophisticated and tactical and strategic in order for it to be effective.
So there's so much to ask in these areas of content and ICP. Starting with the ICP, customer is the highest authority in the business. Amazon has this idea of the empty chair at every meeting. I don't know if you've heard about this, where the empty chair represents the customer. So the idea is that if the customer were here in the meeting with us today, how would that be influencing the decisions that we're making? Because the customer is the highest authority. So getting that ICP right and that alignment is important. But there's a third level to that too, which is how do you really understand your ICP? There's a lot of companies that I've talked to that agree we have a very high degree of familiarity with their ICP. We talk about them every day. We plan for them every day. We track them every day. Or we listen to our gong calls and sales teams and SDR, they're talking to them every day. But do we really understand our ICP? And what do you do to get to the point where you really believe, I understand my ICP? I understand at a critical level their deepest challenges and concerns and risks, more so even than what's associated with our product offering or our tech, because you're selling into an ICP that has this many problems. And you might be this big a part of that solution, but we have to be trusted advisors to our ICP consultants, which means we have to understand them at a much broader level. How do you get to that understanding? How do you know when you've gotten there?
I just don't think we ever know that we've gotten there. I don't think it's ever 100%, but I hear like a few ways that we look at it, and it's a multi-pronged strategy. And it's interesting because your competition is doing this, so you are doing it at the same time. And whoever has that extra piece of understanding of the motivation of their customer actually ends up winning if all service offerings and pricing is the same. A few ways that we look at it, typically like you referenced Forrester a few times, I think having analyst reports is a big one. So in our case, whether it's McKinsey, Everest, Zinnoff, all those areas, I think that truly understands what's happening broader in the market. Secondly, I would say your client partners or your customer success teams are very critical in this as well, because they can start to feed you information, what's happening with your existing customers. And we can start to make assumptions that some of the pain points that they're feeling are also similar motivations that exist in their competitors as well. So when we go after another customer or someone in the same sector, those things start to resonate as similar opportunities as for us to gain intelligence. Thirdly, I would say is there's a lot of good technology available, and I'm sure you've used a variety of them as well. The technologies that we start to use in addition to like the typical LinkedIn and Zoom info, just to get more robust information about the company and the person, is like we've got tools like Drop and Cognism, which looking over the United States and especially into EMEA, these tools start to give you a lot more insight into specific technology being used, things like organizational structures, ways that people are motivated. I think these tools help you get to that further. One of the tools that we're using, that we're trying out, is a tool called Inventurist, an AI-based tool. And we're piloting that right now, and it's quite interesting. So basically what it does, it starts to look at a specific company and starts to look at all the things that are happening in like the news circle in the market around that. And through the AI technology, start to gather that insight. And then they have analysts who prepare that information appropriately on top of that. And that I haven't seen before. Usually the information before that is you calibrate that yourself, but it's nice to have an AI aggregator, and then they have special analysts who tie that together as well. And I would say the fourth one, especially in the startup scale up space, we typically have advisory board, the board of directors. And if you pick the right advisory board members, they're obviously very well connected because they're ex-CIOs or ex-executives at different organizations. I think they're a wealth of knowledge as well because they actually have been in the roles of your ICP often. And they are great influencers of decisions and can tell you how the person in the seat that you're going after feels and what their motivations are. These are kind of like 3 or 4 ways that we try to get kind of closer to 100%. And this might even get you, Steve, only to like 50%. But as you know, like in this space of B2B marketing, it's all about triggers and nuances. And as we get closer, we get better. So it is a moving target. But these are 4 or 5 ways that we look at ICP to get the details.
Yeah, I love that. And the idea that you never really get there. I had a CRO tell me, RCP, it's complex and it's always changing. There's always influencing factors. It's not like, oh, we're redefining our ICP, it's changing. Like the ICP and what they need and their challenges and their problems are always changing. And they're complex because you brought it up, right? There's a buying committee. That buying committee is 3 to 4 times as large as it was 10, 15 years ago. So you've got a very complex, sprawling ICP these days. And one of the biggest takeaways was that it's the biggest competitive advantage. Those who are more curious, more motivated to understand their ICP if everything else is equal. And on average, we have about most companies in the AI space have between 20 to 30 competitors.
Yeah, I believe it. I think the one other thing that people might find interesting would be, especially when you have ranges of companies that you're going after. So we go after companies that are like, say, $500 million to companies that are well over 150 billion. So ICP in a, say, $500 million company is very different and maybe even smaller when we go into health tech in some cases, less than the 500 million. That means you're going after the CIO and likely like 3 or 4 buyers because the CIO is ultimate decision maker in those types of companies. But imagine going into like a multi-billion-dollar Fortune 1000 company when they have not just one organization, the CIO, they actually have like 20 different CIOs of different business units who have buying teams of 20 or 30. Now you're dealing with 100 plus people in different parts of the business and how sophisticated you have to be not to understand that this person who's in the ICP bucket over here actually has a different problem set than this person over here in a different part of the business. And they don't actually know each other because the company's 100,000 people. So these nuances can't be applied generically across your ICP because your ICP could be quite vast and you need to be able to segment that appropriately too.
The complexity goes on and continues. So I want to go back just a little bit after the roadblocks you put out: budget, content, ICP. And so I'm going to ask you a question just to rate content on a scale of 1 to 10, meaning 1 has no impact on the growth and the overall success and vitality of the business. 10, it's vital to the overall growth, success, and vitality of the business. Where would you put it on that scale?
Yeah, I'd have to put it in the realm of like a 8 plus for sure. I'll tell you why. And many may say 10 for sure, right? But in the world of networking and relationships, which a lot of scale ups have to do, advisory board relationships, and obviously executives have a lot of relationships. Well, you can win business just through that. But to truly get the tick and just to continue to grow, I think that's where content starts to move into 8 to 10, especially when you want that consistent growth that's not based on networking and black books. It's based on a demand generation engine. So that's why I would put it higher if you want consistent growth.
You know, there was a Forbes magazine article. They had a quote and it said that content marketing solves problems. Thought leadership sparks conversations. And what I took away from that was, especially in this world where there's a huge trend with the B2B self-service journey, where they're waiting longer and longer and longer to even want to talk to us. And this isn't a small group. This is 80+% of the B2B buyers. And what they're doing is they're consuming more content to make their decisions in the same amount of time. They don't have more time in their day. So the idea is, how do we spark conversations earlier in the buyer's journey where we're being relegated to later and later? That's why I brought up that quote, you know, content marketing solves problems, thought leadership sparks conversations. Just wanted to get your opinion on that and what you thought about that.
Yeah, I'd actually very aligned to you. What I'm finding is that people don't realize the number of touches it takes to actually get to a place where that MQL or even lead turns into a sales qualified lead. The scoring actually tells you that because you require a decent content journey to get you there. So building the right set of assets that resonate with your ICP and getting them in front of them early enough in the right areas that they're self-guiding themselves into a decision. I think you've probably read that in your research. How many decision makers are now self-guiding? They're doing their own research. And if you're not in front of them where they're doing their research with the right collateral, when they're early, obviously it could be ebooks, white papers. As you kind of move into the middle, it could be like more relevant podcast sales scripts, things like that. And later on, it could be like, obviously, what's eventually their service offering, right? I think I'm really understanding that and how each one has to getting something closer and closer to an actual person in pipeline is highly critical. And on the PR side, one of the things I just don't think people understand how actually important PR is. And the way I look at PR, I think it's a very important brand tool. I think it actually could be used for demand generation as well if done correctly. Because the way I've done PR is I've used good agencies who really understand that putting someone's top maybe 7 to 10 thought leaders into the market and getting them on relevant publications, webinars, third-party articles, podcasts, and social media, and they're present. Elevating them actually elevates the company and is a great way to show brand engagement as well. And actually, you can correlate that to even the top of the funnel content, even though it feels like PR might be, most people think, let's just launch a press release. Whereas if you do this other thing correctly by getting on the right publication and get on the news story of what's happening, rather than trying to make your own news, because good luck getting a press release. Elon Musk has launched some interesting Gen AI product, right? He's making news. So now you should jump on that news that is relevant and catch that story and be part of that and get your right thought leaders to give their perspective on that. And the right agencies can get you in the right moments because they have the relationships to get you there. But I think people think that PR is actually just, let's just do a press release and we'll pay the winner over a couple $1,000 to distribute it in the US and Canada or EMEA for impressions. And you know what? We've done PR. But I think if you do it correctly, it actually could yield not just impressions, but good demand and actually could elevate your thought leadership in a branded way and rise kind of all boats with 7 or 10 people looking credible in the organization versus just the brand itself.
And what a lot of people don't realize, we put terms like brand and thought leadership into the long-term bucket, right? Where I had another 3-time B2B CMO on, and she said that today's brand is tomorrow's demand. So without that brand, we aren't going to have the short-term demand that we're looking at. And there's all kinds of studies that talk about how thought leadership, especially in a spaghetti-like buyer's journey, that it might be a thought leadership piece at the very, very end of the buyer's journey that helps give trust and credibility and push it over the edge. That thought leadership actually has very much impact all throughout the buyer's journey. So I love that the PR that promotes the brand, that promotes thought leadership, actually can promote demand gen as well. Makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is that correlating the two together, like the CMO that you mentioned, is actually perfectly accurate. One generates the ability to compete. You want all of a sudden doing brand and PR properly earns you the right to compete because now people know who you are. And then the content, as it kind of gets closer, earns the right to win that business. Oftentimes, if you're a scale up and you're competing against like a Deloitte or somebody massive, everyone knows who that is. So when you launch a piece of content and they can't actually place, I've never heard of you. Therefore, that branded component of doing PR effectively or other brand campaigns is actually critical because sometimes even the best content might not resonate because they don't have the trust that they've actually heard of you before. And that's why these kind of components work together.
I love it. You got to tell you, I've been having such a good time. I didn't even look at the time. We've talked about so much. What I want to do is I want to ask you 2 more questions. And that is when we talk about creating value, what haven't we touched on here that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think that it's actually one of the biggest topics right now, which is the expectation of the CMO and the expectation of the marketing team is faster because the board and the CEO all know that AI exists in terms of the generative AI capabilities to get to market faster as well. So now with those assets available to be able to create content, to be able to create variations of test use cases, to be able to lead scoring, to understand customer engagement, now has to be done in the fraction of a time. And dude, this isn't a secret anymore. I think that marketers who aren't leveraging this capability are actually behind the eight ball because their CEO and their board knows that they have that capability in hand. So that time to value becomes even crunched because of the capability of building assets to get to market to begin with. I think that we didn't talk about that, but I would be remiss to kind of mention that because that is on everyone's minds right now too.
Yeah. And you talk about the expectations for creating value quickly is far accelerated to what it was a year, 2 years ago. If there was one thought, a single takeaway that you wanted people to have from listening to this episode, what would that be?
I'll actually reiterate the word communication. And everyone is not a good communicator. And yeah, I was there and I'm probably still learning as well. But being able to communicate the strategy, which talks about getting the alignment, and then communicating why you need the investment, communicating what the roadmap is doing, inclusive of results, roadblocks, and momentum. I think that to me is actually so critical in being successful because you can actually build an amazing marketing strategy. You can build an amazing roadmap. You can build an amazing kind of budget or marketing calendar, but you don't have alignment because you didn't communicate it properly. You missed the wrong stakeholders, or you didn't articulate in a way that resonates with the CEO. It's game over because you don't have alignment. And the core of that is communication.
I love that. You outlined 3 different levels of communication or all internally within the organization. Hey, Manoj, if people had additional questions for you, would it be appropriate that we give out a link to your LinkedIn profile and they could reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Check it often. So please do. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on and
Yeah.
sharing and giving us perspectives and, levels of communication and alignment that we need to do in order to do things quickly and show that value quickly. I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun and I hope it was super valuable to your listeners out there.